Well, good afternoon, church. It is good to see you. It is good to be back again this afternoon to speak for you. And I appreciate you so much. I just really enjoyed the services this morning, the Bible class, as well as our worship service. And certainly I enjoyed the great fellowship meal that we had out a moment ago. And I ate my share. Somebody said, "You're not going to preach on gluttony, are you?" And I said, "Well, I don't like to condemn myself anymore, and I have to, so probably not." But anyway, it was great, and I appreciate it so much. And I guess since this is Family Day, I will tell the story one more time. Judy and I met up at Freed Hardeman, and anyway, I thought, well, this is great. She's a farm girl from North Carolina, and I grew up with a farm girl, my mother, and she fixed 3 square meals a day for the most part. I can't eat like that anymore, or not get through those doors, whichever the case might be. But anyway, I just decided that, it's great. I've got a good farm girl that, boy, she knows how to cook, and, we're in good shape. Well, she didn't know how to cook. And so anyway, we got married, and I remember that there for the first 2 weeks, we had sandwiches about every meal. And I like sandwiches, and I told her that. I said, and after about 2 weeks, I thought, maybe I need to say something. So we had sandwiches there for about 2 weeks, and then I said, "Honey," I said, I really like sandwiches, I do, but I said, there are other things that you can fix. And then, you could tell that little look came on the face and the tears came down a little bit. And I said, now you've been doing some fine sandwiches, but I said, let's try something else. So we did, and the first meal that she decided that she would fix for us as far as something other than a sandwich, she decided that she would fix some spaghetti. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. I like spaghetti fine. Well, what I had, I like pretty fine anyway. And so anyway, I remember that we came the night, and I was looking forward to that meal. And I remember that I don't know to this day how she did it, but the noodles that she had fixed in the pan, I don't know, she left them in there just long enough so that they weren't stiff anymore or whatever. But I remember that when she dumped out the pan, they stayed in the same form as that pan. And I thought, I don't think I've ever seen noodles like this before. And then I saw the sauce over there, and it was obviously just out of the can. And so I thought, well, I'll not say anything because, after all, I requested this meal. So we sat there, and I sliced off some of those noodles and put them on my plate. And then I poured on a little of that sauce, and it ran everywhere. And so I was thinking, boy, I'm going to dive into this and act like I really like it. Well, I tried. But anyway, let me tell you, the little apartment we were in at that time, it was tiny. And the table we had, we didn't have much room in there, and it was right up against the wall. So I'm at the end of the table. The wall is right here, and she's sitting right here. So I take a bite of that, and I thought, this is going to make me sick. And but anyway, I thought, what am I going to do? I don't want to hurt her feelings. So anyway, I looked over there at her, and I could tell she wasn't too enthusiastic about hers either. She's just kind of picking around at it. And so I don't know what possessed me, but I stripped off one of those noodles, and I just threw it up on the wall. And it stuck, and it hit exactly, and it stayed exactly like it did when I threw it up there. Well, I looked over at her, here there were tears, they're streaming down. Judy's not one to be outdone, though. She stripped off one, and she threw it up there. And then I stripped off another, and she stripped off another, and we finally had the wall just a collage of noodles there on the wall. And so we're laughing by that time. We get up and clean off the wall, and we went down to Hardee's and got us another sandwich. Now, since she is here, let me tell you, I don't want to walk home. She is a fine cook now. Remember that part. And she really is. She's a very fine cook now, and I really appreciate her for that. But it's kind of an evolution that took place there for a while. But I made one of those mistakes, and I'll have to tell this since it's, we're talking more about family here today. I made that mistake that some husbands make that we should never make. I told her finally, I wish you could cook like my mother. Yeah, you understand why I don't have any more hair than I do. But anyway, my wife is not one to take things sitting down very much. You won't get much on her. So when I told her that I wish you could cook like my mother, she took it for a minute and she said, yeah, and I wish you could make money like my daddy. Cleared up that little matter. We didn't have to discuss it anymore. We were good after that. I say in all honesty, she's a wonderful wife, and I really appreciate her so much. We've been married 38 years and looking forward to years to come. And she's been a great wife in every way, and I just appreciate her so very, very much. And I say that Not because it's Family Day and Friends Day, but I say that because it's true. And so it's always good to be back with you. I know you have a lot of good marriages, a lot of good families here, and I appreciate you for that, and God bless you. This afternoon, I'm not going to talk so much about family, but I'm going to talk about something else that's near and dear to my heart, and I think it probably is yours too. But I realize it's an afternoon service, and it's tough right after you've had a big meal, so I'll try to keep that as brief as I think that I can and still get the point across. But let's begin by Bible reading. Let me see your Bibles again. All right, turn with me to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, and I want us to begin reading in just a moment in verse 18. To put this in its context, Paul has written this great epistle of Romans. And in chapter 1, primarily what you see is a vivid image of a nation that has turned its back on God. So I want us to read this afternoon, and then I will make the application here in just a minute. But let's begin with verse 18. I'm reading from the New King James Version. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts. And their foolish hearts were darkened, professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of God to the incorruptible, or changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image like the corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness, and the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even the women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another. Men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves a penalty of their error which was due. And even though they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. As you read this, and as you look around us, I think that you and I both would agree that much of what we see in this passage, we also see in our world today. How is it that America was established on Christian principles and people trying to find religious freedom, that we have gone from that to the highest elected official in our land saying that we are no longer a Christian nation? We have come a long way in the wrong direction as we think about that particular aspect. So today what I want us to do, again, I just want to talk about things that have happened in my lifetime. As you and I think about where we are, the way we grew up, especially those of us that are a little older, as we think back how things have changed. Obviously, sin has been in the world for a long, long time, almost as long as man himself. But as we think about sin and how it has become so dominant in our society, we see that our nation continues to go in a moral spiral downward. So what I want us to do in the next few minutes, I want to talk about 5 things quickly that I believe that have led us to where we are now, that have led us to the moral decay of our society. Number 1, I was a junior in high school on January the 22nd, 1973, when that infamous decision by the Supreme Court of our land was handed down that we know as Roe versus Wade, when it said that it's now legal for a woman to get an abortion in the United States of America. There have been many performed before that, but they were done illegally because it was not a legal thing to be done in this country. But we learned that since 1973 and 2017, we are almost to the 60 million abortions that have been performed in America alone. Many more worldwide, but I'm talking about America right now. Almost 60 million abortions that have been performed since 1973. So what is wrong with abortion? Well, let's just call it simply for what it is. It's murder. It's murder. Romans 13, we learn it's not right to murder. God vents His wrath against murder. We're not supposed to murder anyone. You might say, well, the argument is that, this is an unborn. It's, as some people call it, the neonate. It's really not life. If it's not life, leave it alone. If it's not life, leave it alone. Let's see what happens. But the Bible makes no distinction between intrauterine and extrauterine life. The same word is used for both. If the child is in the womb or if the child has been born, the Bible refers to it the same way. There's no distinction between the two. So God sees us taking life, innocent life from the womb, as something that is wrong. It is murder when we kill babies inside the mother's womb. I don't care if we're doing it in the first trimester, the second, or the third. It's the same thing. So today we learn that abortions take place rampantly all around us. I don't know exactly, I haven't figured out hour-wise, but I would say I'd be pretty close with this in my guesstimation, that on average already in America today, not yesterday, not last week, not last month, but today, on average probably there are already 1,000 innocent children that have been slain by the hands of an abortionist. Now the question to you and me is, have you even thought about it today? Has it even crossed your mind that many? When's the last time you thought about almost 60 million kids in America alone that have been killed since 1973? I remember at that time, although I was relatively young, that there was a great outcry. We thought, oh, this is just going to be a bloodbath in America. We're going to see all these things. It's going to be awful. It's terrible. It's not a dead issue, obviously. But we don't hear nearly as much about it now as we did then. You know why? Because Satan is so good in what he does. We have been desensitized to where we don't think much about it. When we pick up the daily newspaper and we see the murders that happen over here and what's happened over there and what happened here, it just seems to blend in with everything else because there's so much sin, so much corruption in our world anyway, that we don't think much about it. But I'll tell you how we probably miss it. I believe that it takes something usually to get in our faces before we really do much about it. What if you and I had to watch an abortion? I know there's that old thing, I think it came out maybe, early 80s, about the silent scream. Probably some of you have seen that. It's a little video. But what it showed was by a medical doctor who was not a Christian, didn't do it from a Christian perspective, but had performed, I've forgotten, the numerous amounts of abortions. But he finally said I had to give it up because I realized as a doctor I can no longer keep up ethically my belief in what I did and destroy life the way I was doing. But what they did, and I'll tell you, and this is old technology, but what they show is what they call introducing. They're showing the baby. You can make out the image of the baby inside the mother's womb. And they insert an instrument. And as you would know, this is one of the ways, it's one of the ways it still takes place. What they do when they introduce that instrument is they literally rip that baby apart. And they take off arms and legs and such like. And what this particular video shows, although it's old, is when they take this tool and start pulling that baby apart, you see the little baby's mouth fly open. You can't hear it. And that's why they call it the silent scream. You might say, well, that's one of the more inhumane things I've ever heard in my life. If you don't know that already, you're right. And it goes on every day in America. Some of you don't know this, and I don't want to be graphic and gory, but I think you need to know. So I'm going to be as judicious as I know how and tell you something about the late-term abortion, the partial birth abortion. And as best I know how to put it, it's like this. The babies that are large, what they do is they get them in the breech position, they pull the baby out, except the head, because you see if the head comes out, it's a birth. Can't do it then. You have to leave the head inside the mother. So you can't pull the baby all the way out, but you can get it out that far. Now I know this sounds like something that you'd rather not hear, especially after just eating. But they'll take a blunt instrument like a pair of scissors, not necessarily a sharp end, but a pair of scissors. They will quite literally bore a hole in the back of that baby's neck. Then they will use something that we would know as a vacuum. Suck out the brains of that baby. That collapses the skull. And then they take out the rest of the baby. and they say it's fine to do that. You might say again, that's one of the most inhumane things I've ever heard. It is, isn't it? But it takes place. And not always off in New York or Los Angeles. It takes place much closer to home than that. Some you never know about, but they take place in our area too. They really do. But God has not changed His mind about life. But the reason that I bring this particular point up today in this discussion is to say this. I believe that this too has led to the moral decline of our society because it has given a lot of us a cheap view of life because it happens all the time. Number two, in 1962, we back up about 11 years from where we started in 1973, and we learned that there was another decision that was handed down by the Supreme Court of America that said no longer will school prayer be allowed. In other words, when I can remember as a youngster that you would go into Bible class, or not Bible, going to school class, going to Bible class, yes, but going to school class, it was almost like a Bible class when you first started, because they would have a scripture reading, and they would have prayer. Some of you older folks, you remember that. It was something that happened every day. And we just thought that was a part of it, and you know, nothing wrong with it. It was great until the Supreme Court said you can't do it anymore. It's unlawful to do that because you'll offend somebody else. You know, the story and all the gamut that we went through with that. But they said you can't do it. Now, let me jump ahead a few years. What was it? Around the turn, maybe 1999, around the turn of the century. I remember I was in a gospel meeting. We've had a lot of school shootings and such like, and I'm brokenhearted by every one of them, as you are. But it seemed like kind of the forerunner of all that was Columbine. That's the one that we heard about and really disturbed us the most when it first happened. And I remember that I'd been out doing some visiting and such like, and I came in that afternoon to study, and I just happened to turn on the TV for a little while, and boy, it was everywhere about this shooting that's taking place out in Columbine. And it was awful. It still is awful. Nothing good about what happened there that day. But I thought there was a bit of irony as I watched the TV, because this was something kind of new to us in America, that the President of the United States then had his face shown on TV, and he's telling America, pray for these folks. Pray for these folks. And I thought, isn't that interesting? That the President is now telling everybody to pray for these folks, telling them to do something that effectively, lawfully, they couldn't do in school just a few hours before that. I had a member of the church come up and tell me one time when I made some statement like this. He said, you know, I taught school for years. And he said, I've always told my kids that this is not an issue because they can pray anytime. Well, yeah, in a sense, I agree with that. But here's the problem I have with that. You're trying to tell kids to make a grown-up decision while they're still kids. You see, they're in school to be led. They're in school to be taught. They're in school to have modeled the things that they're supposed to learn in life. And if the adults, the teachers that are there are not able to do that, then obviously we're missing a great part of that puzzle. When you take God out of anything, you can't expect anything good to happen. You can expect bad things to happen. There are a lot of these that are out there, but there are moral graphs. If you'll look from 1973 to 2017, you would think like most graphs, you know, they either go up, down, sideways, but I'll tell you how this one is, and you can look it up for yourself. You'll see that the moral decline is sharp from 1973 to 2017 with our young people. And there's no real surprise about that because righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. So when you take God out of anything, everything goes. And that's pretty well where we're getting to in our day and time. So, number two, after abortion, I say that school prayer being removed has been a terrible thing in the development morally of our young people, but affecting us all in some degree. Number three, I know we've already talked about this, but I'm going to take it from a little different angle. I think that another thing that we have seen is the breakdown of family. We've already said, as we have said many times before, it kind of begins and ends there, or it surely begins there, of how we teach and how we understand things and how we learn to respect God and such like. But we, many times, have had problems with divorce in America. We used to say it's like 4 to 7 years. You know, they're talking about the 7-year itch, etc. In other words, there were so many divorces that happened during that time period. But there was something that happened a few years ago, and it's been more than just a few now. It's been probably 20 to 30 years ago now, that really kind of washed the foundation out from under solid marriages anyway. Because rather than the people that probably got married when they were immature, people that went through those early struggles and probably never should have gotten married to begin with, we moved from that to the folks that have been married 20 and 25 and 30 years and more that now started getting a divorce. And when that happened, it seemed to just kind of erode so much out from under the stability of family life. Did you know that 1/3 of all white children now live with one parent or guardian? Did you know if you move to the black community, 2/3 of all black children live with one parent or guardian? There are millions of kids that go to bed every night and they don't know who their dad is. There's so many kids that go to bed every night, they don't know who mom is. And so there's so much that has happened that's destroyed the family life, not from God's point of view, what we've done to it. God's ways still work. But because of the breakdown in family, here is something that you and I have come to see on a pretty common basis. Gangs. G-A-N-G-S. They've been in the big cities for a long time, but they've moved to the rural areas now. And a lot of these kids are getting involved in gangs. But if you'll listen to them, they'll tell you why. What do they call those gangs that they involve themselves with? Family. This is my family. Well, why would you claim that as a family? Because I don't have one otherwise. You see, we developed a subculture by the letdown of God's principles in our lives because we are not any longer honoring His ways, and so we are really making it hard on our young people that are coming along. So, another great moral decline, and since I've already dealt with this, I'm not going to say any more, would be just the breakdown in family life, family structure. Number 4, as I think about this, there's been a real cultural change, and I think all these things play into it. And it has affected us in so many ways. What do you and I hear so much today, and I sometimes just kind of want to spit when I hear it. I get so tired of hearing politically correct. Politically correct. And you know, we hear it, and we've heard it for so long, we're just tired of it. And I'm just worn out with it. But you know, it's hard not to offend anybody. Everybody's got their, their feelings out on their fingernails, seems like. I'm offended by that. And we need to grow up. There are just some things that are what they are. But it has affected us as a nation. It has affected us in truth. There was a time, even in the community of where we live, that folks had a good sense of right and wrong. Now, they might not have done the right things, but when I was growing up, everybody pretty well knew, whether they went to church or not, they pretty well knew what was right or wrong. And usually, even for the non-going church folks, for Christians who stood up for principles, they had respect for that. They might not have honored it, but they respected those that would stand up for what was right and good. But somehow or another, the fences have been torn down. It seemed to be that there was a time in our nation that the good, the moral, was tilted in the Christian's favor. But we've lived long enough now to see that the pendulum has swung to the other direction to where no longer is that the case. Christians are becoming some of the most persecuted people in the world. If you haven't figured that out, you will eventually. And it's not getting better. So there's been a real attitudinal shift in morals. We've always had our struggles when we talked about moral things. We've always had our differences. There have been some folks that would say, well, I kind of see it this way and I kind of see it this way. But the Bible pretty well was respected to be the final authority. But I'm not so sure that's the case with most folks anymore. It seems that we've grown an attitude that says, I really don't care. Because I'm more concerned about me and what I want and doing it my way. Because that's the most important thing to me. One of the reasons for that? One of the greatest influences of that It's that one-eyed monster that most of us have probably 3 sets of in our house. It's called the TV. You see, I'm a baby boomer. And I don't say that proudly. I'm just saying matter-of-factly, I'm a part of that baby boomer generation. Now we got the millennials and such like, but we were the first generation to grow up with the TV as a babysitter. Before that, they didn't have it. And when you think about in the average household that thing is on over 50 hours a week, and those kids and those mamas and daddies and those teenagers, they're all sitting there and taking that stuff in. Did you know that over 30,000 incidences occur on ABC, NBC, CBS, those 3 major networks alone, not counting cable and such like, of profanity and immorality and violence every single year. And when you feed your mind with this stuff over and over again, it's going to change your mind. It's going to change your thinking about some things. And that's the reason now that with a lot of our young people, even though they might have grown up in church, some of them might say, well, you know, I don't think the homosexuality is a right way to do things. But they don't have the strong built-in values like some of us that are older, because they have been taught very differently by that one-eyed monster more than anything else, that we need to learn to accept everybody. Now, I believe that we are to love everybody. Don't get me wrong with that. But we're never to love sin. But that one-eyed monster has told us we need to love sin too. And there are a lot of folks that have believed it. Taking that a step further, here's the next point that I would make that we see, and it's mentioned in Romans 1, that has led and continues to lead us in a very bad direction in our country. And that is the upsurgence of homosexuality. This makes me uncomfortable. I'll just be right up front with you. And I'm sure that when we think about it, even in a church setting, makes us all a little bit ill at ease. But we just can't ignore it. Now, the Bible has a lot to say about it. Romans 1 is one of the classic passages of saying, here's what a nation does when it turns its back on God. Even women will start being attractive and attracted to and acting out on having relationships with women, and men the same with men. If you look back at the fall of the Roman Empire, you learn that those Caesars, every one except one, not only had their wives, but they had their boys. And that's just a matter of fact. Easily found out, traced out in history. But we learned that Rome was becoming more and more corrupt, and no doubt that was a big part. You see, when you go so far into something, you can't continue to go in the same direction because it becomes old to you after a while, so you have to twist it, distort it to make it something different. And really, that's what homosexuality is. But let me take this a step further. And I know I dealt with this some when I was here in the meeting, but I want to say this here again because I'm hearing so much of it. You know, one of the biggest problems we're having in the church right now in the moral realm? It has to do with pornography. And there is so much of it on the internet, computer, smartphone. There's so much of it on TV. You don't have to have what we call the premium channels. All you have to do is turn it on. And it might be something that's relatively decent that you're watching. Then the commercials are terrible when it comes to moral things. And all of this is feeding us more and more all the time. Seems like, I don't watch a lot of sitcoms, but it seems like, at least the advertisements I've seen, that still the number one character that Hollywood likes to push out there anymore is the gay character. And they're the hero. They're the new kids on the block. They're the ones that, you know, we need to learn how to love and respect. Well, there again, love them, yes, but you can't love the sin because it's never been right in God's sight and it never will be. Here's the argument generally. I'm not going into all the aspects of this, but let me just say this. Here's the thing I hear more than anything else. But you see, God made me this way. And you see, that seems to be okay to say that in our world anymore. You've heard it too, right? God made me this way. Let me turn that a little bit and ask you something in a different way. I can understand that, yes, there could be a same-sex attraction. I understand that. It could be. But that's not sinful in and of itself. But it's what you do with it when the sin comes along. But think about this. I'm not going to put myself, but let's just say here's a man and his wife. The man says, I'm attracted to other women. Couldn't he say, God made me this way? If we followed that other argument. God made me this way, so obviously He wants me to act out on it. So I can be with as many women as I want to because God made me this way. You'll never buy that. But it's the same kind of argument that is often used in our world for those of same-sex attraction. But let me tell you something, parents. Let me tell you something. Listen to this, grandparents. We've got a lot of kids now, more than ever, that are beginning to experiment more and more in this area because they see so much of it, so much is pushed in their direction. And yeah, I think it's like about anything. You can learn to like it if you spend enough time there. We need to understand that. We also need to understand that it's not a part of God's plan. It's just not right. How many homosexuals are there in our world? 2 to 3%. You might say, oh, I thought there were more than that. But think about how many that is. As far as we know, 2 to 3% of the population in the United States would say, I'm gay. When you think about, from this standpoint, the churches of Christ, about everywhere you can go, you can find a church of Christ. Somewhere now, might be few and far between as we get out of this area. But I'm just saying, usually about wherever you go, you can find churches. And if you were to line every member of the Church of Christ up side by side, and then you line up every gay person on the other side by side, they would easily outnumber us 2 to 3 to 1. So that actually helps you to understand a little more of how a great problem this is. And it's not going away. It's becoming even greater because it's becoming so accepted in our world. But that's a society that's turned its back on God. That's a society that's going downhill morally. And it's something that we're seeing more and more in that downward spiral of the morality of America. But finally today, one other thing that I believe has been a great contributor to the moral decline, and I don't say this of everyone, I wouldn't say it of you, but I think the general direction of church. Because there are some folks, rather than trying to fight it, they're just trying to adapt to it. Now I know that, there are certain things, that we can change, and, I'm just talking about times of services and things. We know that there are some changes we can make and always be on God's good terms. But you can't change His principles and laws and precepts. They're solid. They don't change. It's amazing to me how that so many in the religious world have now tried to conform their ways to accommodate the people rather than trying to teach that people need to accommodate their ways to the will of God. And if that is the case, it is truly backward. It will never be right until we turn it around. God always is supreme. God always is number one. Unless we do things His way, we'll never be right with Him. It just kind of floors me sometimes to think that there are religious groups that have given in. I remember, and not to the extreme that we're talking about, but I remember a couple of years ago, I was preaching at a certain place in a gospel meeting, and I preached on modest apparel. You'd think that, everybody would be somewhat on the same page with modest apparel. But I remember when I got through with that particular lesson, the preacher got up in the pulpit, and I don't say this to put him down. He said, I thought we'd given up on that one. He said, I thought we'd just capitulated. I thought we'd just thrown in the towel. I thought we weren't even arguing that anymore because we had lost that battle. We can't ever lose God's battles. They're always going to be the ones to stand up for and ones that we need to live for every day. I know there are other things that we can mention, but I've taken enough time this afternoon. But I believe these are 5 things that we can see for the lifetime of most of us that we have seen lead us downward in a moral spiral. But let me turn it quickly to say this. You might say, well, I'm thoroughly depressed now. I can leave and go home and just, I'll feel bad the rest of the day. I don't want you to, so let me say something positive before I quit. Even though we are headed downward, there are some sociologists that say now that we've gone too far, that we can't turn things around. They've gone so far now, we never can. I know it might seem for you and me in a hopeless situation, but I'll tell you this. With God, all things are possible. And you see, if anybody is ever going to make a difference in this world, it's going to be us. God's people are the ones that have to stand up and be counted. God's people are the ones that in a loving way, is preaching the truth in love, we're going to have to say, this is what's right. God is right. I don't care what the world might say. God is right. And this is the only way we can ever do things where we will be profitable, where God will bless our nation. Most of you are familiar with that Old Testament passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, when God said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, turn their faces from sin, He said, then I will hear from heaven. Then I will forgive their sins and I will heal their land. That principle is still just as true today as it ever has been. I believe as Christians we need to pray as hard and as fervently as we ever have. Not only for ourselves, but also the healing of our land, for the turning around of the moral decay of America. I believe that we need to live it. I don't mean that we have to be people who are ugly and the people that are out here, shooting folks and things. And no, there are always the radicals out there. But in a loving Christian way, we need to say, I'm willing to stand up and I'm willing to stand my ground for what is right and what is good. Now, I believe that when we do that we can make a difference in this world. Paul said in Philippians chapter 2 that we are like shining lights in this world. When someone stands up for what is right and they live the right thing, man, your light is brighter now than it ever has been before, because the world is a very dark place. Yes, we've seen a lot of things go down, but I believe there's always hope in Jesus. But rather than thinking about it in a national sense, as I close here today, we begin in a personal sense. You see, you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't lead where you don't go. So what I'm saying is that change begins with you and me. It begins with me in saying, Stan, you've got to know where you stand. You've got to know what God's will is. You've got to have the courage to stand up. And you've got to have the love for other folks to say in a loving way that you're wrong when they're doing wrong. You've got to say that's wrong when it's wrong. You've got to say that's right when it's right. And be glad to do so because you're a representative of Jesus Christ here on this earth. I believe that when we make a difference in ourselves, then we'll make a difference in our communities. And when we make a difference in our communities, we'll make a difference in our state. And when we make a difference in our state, we'll make a difference in our nation. And when we make a difference in our nation, we'll make a difference in this world. You might say, but there's so much. We've got to start somewhere. And I don't know of any better place to start than right here and right now with you and me to say we are going to follow Jesus. Before we sing this invitation song, let me just say that there may be someone here today that says, I'm ready to make my stand with Jesus. And if you are, we're so glad. But more than that, heaven is rejoicing because you're willing to make that move. If you've never been baptized, this would be a marvelous time to do it. Jesus said, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. Maybe you say, well, I'm a Christian, but I've just not been living the way I ought to. There are a lot of things about my life I need to correct. You can correct those right now. You can repent. You can turn things around because we serve a God of a second chance. So this afternoon, as we sing this song of encouragement, if there's anyone who needs to make his or her life right with God, before we leave this assembly, we pray that you will. Even more so, God encourages you to do that very thing, and you have that opportunity right now. So if you need to do it, please do it, while together we stand and sing this song of encouragement.